September 8, 1941. A ring of steel closed around one of the greatest cities on Earth. Not for a week, not for a month. For 872 days, Leningrad, the second largest city in the Soviet Union, home to nearly 3 million people, was completely cut off from the rest of the world by German and Finnish forces. No supply convoys, no escape routes, no relief. What followed was not just a military siege. It was a slow, deliberate attempt to erase a city and everyone inside it through starvation, bombardment, and cold. Not by storming the walls, but by waiting for death to do the work. And what the people inside that city endured, survived, and documented is something history has rarely seen, and that no film has ever fully captured. This is the story of Leningrad. Before we go any further, there's something most people don't know about this siege. Hitler never intended to capture Leningrad through street combat. He issued a direct order. The city was not to be accepted, even if it surrendered. The plan was to destroy it entirely, level it to the ground, and hand the territory to Finland. That changes everything about what you're about to hear. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Leningrad was. Named after Vladimir Lenin in 1924, it was formerly St. Petersburg, the imperial capital of Russia, one of Europe's most architecturally magnificent cities. The Hermitage Museum, one of the world's largest art collections, sat at its center. The city was home to world-class universities, opera houses, factories, and a population of artists, intellectuals, engineers, and workers who had lived through revolution, civil war, and the brutal collectivization of the 1930s. They were not strangers to hardship. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the largest military invasion in human history, Leningrad was one of 3 primary objectives, alongside Moscow and Kiev. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, drove through the Baltic states with terrifying speed. Within weeks, they had crossed hundreds of miles of Soviet territory. The Soviet military response was catastrophic in the early weeks. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. The German advance seemed unstoppable. By late August 1941, German forces had cut the last land railway connecting Leningrad to the Soviet interior. The city's population began to grasp what was happening. Mass evacuation had started earlier in the summer, but hundreds of thousands of civilians from surrounding areas had also flooded into the city, fleeing the German advance, swelling the population at precisely the wrong moment. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured Schlisselburg, a town at the southern tip of Lake Ladoga. The last land corridor was severed. The ring was closed. Roughly 2.5 to 3 million civilians were now trapped inside, along with Soviet military forces defending the city. What happened next was not sudden, it was calculated. The Soviet leadership in Moscow, including Stalin himself, understood the crisis, but they also understood the symbolic weight of Leningrad. It was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Surrendering it was politically unthinkable. The city would be defended, period. But defending a city requires feeding its people. And Leningrad had made a critical, catastrophic miscalculation. When the siege began, the city's food reserves were dangerously low. Soviet logistics officials had not adequately prepared for a prolonged encirclement scenario of this scale. Food warehouses contained stocks estimated to last weeks, not years. On September 12, 1941, just 4 days after the ring closed, Leningrad's military council conducted a precise inventory of available food. What they found was grim. Grain and flour, approximately 35 days of supply. Cereals and pasta, roughly 30 days. Meat and meat products, 33 days. Fats, 45 days. Sugar and confectionery, 60 days. With nearly 3 million mouths inside the city, these numbers were a death sentence if no resupply could be established quickly. The German Luftwaffe, aware of the situation, bombed the Badaev warehouses on September 8th, the same day the ring closed. Enormous stockpiles of food went up in flames. For years, Soviet accounts somewhat overstated the significance of this single event as the primary cause of the famine, while modern historians note that even those reserves wouldn't have lasted long regardless. The real problem was structural. The city simply did not have enough food for a prolonged siege of that scale, and the supply lines were gone. Ration cuts began almost immediately. By October 1941, workers in the most demanding industrial jobs received 400 grams of bread per day. Dependents, the elderly, children, those not doing physical labor, received 200 grams. 200 grams. That's roughly 2 thin slices of bread. Except it wasn't really bread. As flour ran out, bakers began mixing in cellulose, processed wood pulp, cottonseed cake, bran, malt, and other fillers. The bread that Leningraders received had a caloric value far below what even those numbers suggest. The human body requires a minimum of approximately 1,500 calories per day to maintain basic organ function at rest. The rations being issued in Leningrad by November 1941 provided, in many cases, between 300 and 500 calories. People began to starve. November 1941 brought what survivors would later call simply the hungry winter, though calling it that barely scratches the surface. The temperature in Leningrad dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius and below. The city's heating systems failed. Pipes froze and burst. Electricity was cut to near nothing. Trams stopped running. Water had to be fetched from holes cut in the Neva River ice and carried by hand across frozen streets. People burned everything: furniture, books, door frames, parquet floors, anything that could produce heat. But heat without food only slows the dying. Leningrad's death records from this period are among the most staggering demographic data points of the entire Second World War. In November 1941, approximately 11,000 people died of starvation and related conditions. In December, the number rose to over 52,000. In January 1942, it reached approximately 100,000 or more in a single month. Bodies appeared in the streets. There were not enough healthy people, nor enough fuel to bury them quickly. Some families kept the deaths of relatives secret for days in order to continue collecting their ration cards. Dystrophy, the clinical term for the physical deterioration caused by severe, prolonged malnutrition, became the official diagnosis on death certificates. Doctors in Leningrad began recognizing stages of starvation with the precision of a separate medical discipline. They documented how the body consumes itself. First fat reserves, then muscle tissue, then organ function begins to fail. They noted the physical symptoms: the swelling from edema as the body attempts to retain fluids, the translucent skin, the inability to walk, the mental fog. And they kept working. Doctors, nurses, hospital staff, many of them dying alongside their patients, continued to function because there was no alternative. One detail that appears in multiple survivor testimonies and historical records deserves particular attention. People fell in the streets and did not always get up. Passers-by, themselves too weak to help, sometimes could not stop. This was not callousness. It was the arithmetic of survival at its most brutal limit. There was one fragile thread connecting Leningrad to the outside world. Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe, lies just east of the city. While German and Finnish forces controlled the land approaches to Leningrad, they did not fully control Lake Ladoga. This created a narrow opportunity. During the summer and fall of 1941, Soviet barges and small vessels attempted to cross the lake under constant German air attack, bringing limited supplies to the besieged city and evacuating some civilians. The losses were severe. German aircraft targeted the convoys relentlessly. But when winter came and the lake froze, something extraordinary happened. By late November 1941, the ice was thick enough, barely, to support light traffic. Soviet engineers and military personnel ventured out onto the frozen surface and began laying an improvised road. It was called the Ice Road, and it would later be known to history as the Doroga Zhizny, the Road of Life. Trucks, heavily loaded with food, ammunition, and supplies, drove across the frozen lake at night or under air cover, often without headlights, navigating by markers planted in the ice. The surface cracked under the weight. Vehicles broke through and sank. Drivers died in the frozen water. German aircraft bombed the road constantly, and yet it kept moving. In the other direction, away from Leningrad, the trucks carried the most vulnerable: children, the severely ill, the wounded. More than 1 million civilians were evacuated across Lake Ladoga during the siege period. Many did not survive the journey. Some died of starvation mid-transit, their weakened bodies unable to tolerate even the movement. The supplies that came in were never enough. The road of life saved Leningrad from total annihilation, but it could not stop the dying. It could only slow it. Rations were incrementally increased beginning in late December 1941, minimally, painfully, but enough to pull back from the absolute cliff edge of total population collapse. This chapter is difficult, but it is documented, and it must be said. When there is no food, human beings discover what they are willing, and not willing, to do to survive. In Leningrad, people ate things that have no category in ordinary life. Carpenter's glue was boiled into a gelatin and consumed. Leather belts and book bindings were boiled and eaten. Wallpaper paste was scraped from walls. It contained traces of potato starch. Lipstick, petroleum jelly, and machine grease were consumed by some. People ate household pets. They ate rats and pigeons until those populations disappeared entirely from the city. They ate boiled pine needles, which provided minimal nutrition but were consumed partly for psychological relief and partly because vitamin C from the needles helped combat scurvy. The city's leadership was aware of all of this. Leningrad's scientists and researchers began systematically investigating what substances in the city could be converted into edible products. They found ways to extract protein from processed peat, to use yeast cultures grown in industrial conditions, to add nutritional value to food, and to produce a vitamin supplement from pine needle extract that was distributed to help prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. These were not random acts of desperation. They were organized, rational responses to an unprecedented crisis, and they saved lives. The question of cannibalism is one that historians have confronted directly. Soviet archives, partially declassified after 1991, contain records of police investigations and prosecutions for cannibalism during the siege, both of corpses and, in documented cases, of living people. Historians, including Sergei Yarov, who wrote extensively on the Leningrad siege using primary sources, have confirmed these records exist and document real events. These cases were in the hundreds, not thousands, a small fraction of the total population, and the Soviet authorities prosecuted them aggressively. This is part of the documented historical record of the siege. It represents the absolute outer boundary of what human beings endure when starving at scale. And it is included here because the historical record demands honesty, not because it represents the character or choices of the overwhelming majority of Leningrad's population who did not do this. Here is what makes Leningrad unlike almost any other city in any other siege in history. It kept functioning, not fully, not without enormous sacrifice, but it functioned. Leningrad's factories, despite constant bombardment, despite workers collapsing from starvation at their machines, produced tanks, artillery shells, weapons, and equipment throughout the siege. Workers who could not walk to their posts were sometimes carried. Workers who died on shifts were carried out and the remaining workers continued. The Kirov factory, one of the Soviet Union's most important heavy manufacturing plants, produced tanks within range of German artillery and was shelled repeatedly. Production continued. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra had been evacuated, but musicians who remained in the city formed a new ensemble. On August 9, 1942, a date specifically chosen because it was the date Hitler had told his officers he expected to celebrate in the city, Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, was performed in the besieged city. Shostakovich had composed it partly in Leningrad and partly after his evacuation. The performance was broadcast over loudspeakers throughout the city and across German lines. Soldiers sat in the audience in military uniforms. Some musicians had to be brought from hospitals. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, later said he nearly passed out during rehearsals from hunger. The performance lasted 80 minutes. The city listened. People wept in the streets. German soldiers who heard the broadcast from their lines later described it as deeply unsettling, evidence that the city was still alive in ways their command had not anticipated. Schools operated for periods of the siege. Libraries remained open. People read. People wrote diaries. Hundreds of diaries and journals from the siege have been preserved, and they are among the most important first-person documents from the entire Second World War. Scientists at the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry, a seed bank containing specimens of thousands of plant varieties, guarded their collection throughout the siege. Some of the scientists starved to death in the building while surrounded by food that could not be eaten, because the seeds had to be preserved for future agricultural research. They died protecting the future. No account of the Leningrad siege is complete without looking directly at what happened to the city's children. At the beginning of the siege, hundreds of thousands of children were still in the city. Evacuation efforts had begun in the summer of 1941, but they were complicated, chaotic, and in some cases tragically counterproductive. In one documented case, trainloads of children evacuated eastward were bombed by German aircraft. The children who remained faced starvation alongside their parents. In many cases, they faced it alone. Adults who died left children to navigate a city in collapse. The diaries of children and adolescents from the siege are preserved in Russian archives and have been studied extensively. Tanya Savicheva, an 11-year-old girl, kept a small notebook in which she recorded the deaths of her family members one by one, with dates. Her entries became some of the most cited documents from the siege. Zhenya died on December 28, 1941 at noon. Grandma died on January 25, 1942 at 3 in the afternoon. Leka died on March 17, 1942 at 5 in the morning. Uncle Vasya died on April 13, 1942 at 2 at night. Uncle Lesha died on May 10, 1942 at 4 in the afternoon. Mama died on May 13, 1942 at 7:30 in the morning. Savichevs died. Everyone died. Only Tanya is left. Tanya herself was evacuated from Leningrad in 1942, but died in 1944 from the effects of prolonged starvation, tuberculosis, and other conditions. She was 14 years old. Her notebook has long been cited as evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials, though historians note the exact chain of custody is difficult to verify with certainty. What is certain is that her diary became one of the most recognized documents to survive the siege, and it remains on display today at the Museum of Leningrad History. Children who survived the siege often described a strange loss of childhood, not in the metaphorical sense, but literally. They did not play. There was no play. There was only cold and hunger, and the task of getting through the next day. Adolescents worked in factories alongside adults. Children carried water from the river. They stood in bread lines for hours in sub-zero temperatures. And yet, and this is documented in testimony after testimony, many of them protected each other. Older children looked after younger ones. Siblings shared portions. Teachers who continued working in whatever form school took during the siege described children showing up day after day in classrooms so cold that breath was visible, refusing to stop learning. The blockade was not the only weapon used against Leningrad. German and Finnish artillery shelled the city throughout the siege. Over 150,000 artillery shells struck Leningrad during the 872 days of the blockade. More than 100,000 incendiary and explosive bombs were dropped from the air. The shelling followed patterns. Certain streets, certain intersections, certain times of day were more dangerous than others. Leningraders over time learned these patterns. They adjusted their routes. They noted which side of a street offered more protection. They posted warning signs at particularly targeted corners. Air raid shelters were used throughout, but starvation-weakened people had difficulty reaching them quickly. Many simply stopped going to shelters as the siege dragged on, out of exhaustion, or the fatalistic logic that a shell was a faster death than starvation. The Hermitage Museum, one of the world's most important repositories of art and culture, took direct hits during the siege. Its famous collection, more than 1 million objects, had been partially evacuated in the summer of 1941, with the most significant pieces shipped eastward in crates. Museum staff who remained guarded what was left and documented the damage systematically. After the war, restoration work on the building and its remaining contents began immediately. The Hermitage still stands today. Hospital patients were not spared. Schools that were operating were not spared. A March 1942 artillery strike on a city street killed dozens of people waiting in a bread line. The dead and injured were absorbed into a city that had already internalized catastrophe. Leningraders did not stop moving. They adapted. History demands honesty, and that means examining the Soviet government's role in what happened to Leningrad's civilians, not only as defenders of the city, but as decision-makers whose choices had direct consequences for the death toll. The siege conditions were not solely the result of German military action. Several decisions by Soviet authorities affected civilian survival in ways that historians have scrutinized carefully. Evacuation before the siege closed could have been conducted on a larger scale and with greater urgency. The Soviet leadership's initial insistence that the situation would be stabilized quickly, a characteristic of Stalin-era military decision-making in the summer of 1941, delayed some evacuation measures that might have reduced the number of civilians trapped inside the ring. The decision to allow Tame failed to prevent large numbers of civilian refugees from surrounding occupied areas to flow into Leningrad in the summer of 1941, rather than directing them eastward, increased the population requiring feeding during the siege. Ration distribution was not equal. Party officials, military personnel, and certain categories of workers consistently received higher allocations than dependents and non-essential workers. This stratification was real and documented in Soviet records. At the same time, it is equally documented that Leningrad's local authorities, under Party Secretary Andrei Zhdanov, worked intensively to organize food production alternatives within the city, managed ration distribution to a population on the edge of collapse, coordinated military defense, and maintained some level of civil administration under conditions that had no historical precedent in modern urban warfare. The full moral accounting of the siege involves acknowledging both what was done for the city and what was done to it by the German forces that imposed the blockade with explicit intent to starve the population, and by the Soviet system that made decisions, some of which cost lives in response. This is not a simple story. It was not a simple time. January 12, 1943. After 16 months of the siege, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, Spark. Two Soviet army groups, the Leningrad Front from inside the city and the Volkhov Front from the east, attacked simultaneously, attempting to break the German stranglehold along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The fighting was brutal. The terrain, forests, swamps, and frozen ground was extraordinarily difficult. German defenses were well prepared. Casualties were enormous on both sides. On January 18, 1943, the two Soviet forces linked up near the town of Schlisselburg, the same town whose capture had completed the encirclement 16 months earlier. A narrow land corridor, roughly 8 to 11 kilometers wide, had been punched through the German lines. This was not the end of the siege. German forces still surrounded the city on multiple sides, and their artillery could still reach Leningrad. But it was the first break in the ring. Within weeks, Soviet engineers working under fire laid a railway line through the newly opened corridor. Supplies began flowing into the city overland for the first time in 16 months. Rations increased. The most acute starvation began to ease. The full lifting of the siege came on January 27, 1944, 872 days after it began. Soviet forces launched massive coordinated offensives that shattered German Army Group North and drove German forces away from the city entirely. When the all-clear was announced, Leningraders who had survived described the moment in terms that moved far beyond relief. Some people stood in the streets unable to speak. Others wept without knowing how to stop. The city organized a fireworks display. 24 salvos from 324 guns illuminated the night sky over Leningrad. It was the first fireworks display in the city in more than 2 years. People who had not seen celebration in any form for nearly 3 years stood in January cold and watched the sky. Any honest reckoning with the Leningrad siege must confront its death toll and acknowledge that precise figures are still debated by historians because the Soviet government for decades suppressed the full scale of civilian losses. During the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors presented a figure of approximately 632,000 civilian deaths from starvation during the siege. This figure was cited in official Soviet records for decades. Post-Soviet research, drawing on declassified archive material, demographic analysis, and regional records, has generally revised this figure significantly upward. Current scholarly estimates for total civilian deaths during the siege from all causes, starvation, bombardment, disease, cold, and related conditions, range from approximately 800,000 to over 1 million people. Some demographic analyses, accounting for the difference between the pre-siege population and the post-siege population adjusted for evacuations, suggest the true figure may be higher still. For perspective, the total American military deaths in all of World War II numbered approximately 407,000. The civilian dead of Leningrad alone may have exceeded twice that number. The vast majority of these deaths were from starvation. The worst single months were November 1941 through February 1942, when the city lost between 50,000 and 100,000 or more people per month to hunger and cold. The physical evidence of this is still present in Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg again since 1991. Mass graves from the siege period contain hundreds of thousands of bodies. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, the largest such site, contains the remains of approximately 500,000 victims of the siege and the broader Battle of Leningrad, buried in long, grass-covered mounds. A stone figure stands at the center of the cemetery, a woman representing the motherland, looking over the dead with an eternal wreath of oak leaves. Visitors have left flowers at those mounds every year since the memorial opened in 1960. They still do. The Siege of Leningrad ended more than 80 years ago, but it left traces that reach forward into the present in ways that are not always obvious. The survivors, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, carried the siege with them for the rest of their lives in ways that medical and psychological research has since documented. Studies of Leningrad survivors conducted in the decades after the war found elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal conditions, and psychological trauma consistent with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Survivors who were children during the siege showed distinctive patterns of health problems in later life, linked to prolonged childhood malnutrition. The diaries are perhaps the most enduring human record of what happened inside the ring. Hundreds of personal diaries, letters, and notebooks have been preserved in Russian archives, museums, and private family collections. Scholars have spent decades reading and analyzing them. They describe in ordinary language extraordinary things: the decision to give a portion of bread to a child, the moments of unexpected beauty, a winter sky, a piece of music heard from a window, that survivors mentioned as anchors of their humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. Lena Mukina, a teenager who kept a diary throughout the siege, wrote about going to the theater during the siege, about continuing to notice and describe the world around her, even as people were dying in the streets. Her diary, published decades later, reads as a document of almost defiant humanity. The Leningrad Symphony, Shostakovich's seventh, is still performed. It runs close to 80 minutes. When orchestras play it today, the record of what it meant, performed in a starving, shelled city by musicians who could barely stand, broadcast to an enemy who expected silence, is part of what the audience receives. The Vavilov Institute seed bank, whose scientists died protecting specimens rather than eating them, still exists in St. Petersburg. It remains one of the world's most significant collections of agricultural plant diversity. These are not small things. They are the evidence that something in Leningrad, some collective decision, made by millions of individual people under conditions that should have broken them, refused to go out. It would be easy to file the Leningrad siege under things that happened in the past and move on. It would also be a mistake. The Siege of Leningrad is a documented case study in what human beings are capable of, in both directions. The deliberate use of starvation as a weapon against a civilian population, explicitly ordered at the highest level of the German command, was a war crime by any definition that word has ever carried. The Nuremberg tribunals treated it as such. At the same time, what the people inside that city did The diaries they kept, the music they played, the seeds they protected, the children they fed before themselves, the factories they staffed while starving, is a documented record of human endurance and moral choice under conditions of absolute extremity. There is something in that record that speaks across time and across belief systems. For those who hold to a faith that affirms the dignity and indestructibility of the human person, that every human life carries weight that no political order can extinguish, Leningrad is evidence. Not comfortable evidence, evidence purchased at enormous and unjust cost, but evidence nonetheless. The people of Leningrad were not superheroes. They were ordinary people, workers, students, musicians, scientists, teachers, children, placed in conditions that should have erased them. Most of them simply decided each day to get through the next day. 872 days of getting through the next day. That is what actually happened. On January 27, 1944, when the guns finally went quiet around Leningrad, and the official announcement came that the siege was fully lifted, survivors described a reaction that went far beyond simple joy. One Leningrader, Olga Grechina, recorded that people pulled out what little vodka they had left. They sang, they cried, they laughed. And yet, in her own words, it was sad all the same, because the losses had been too large to set aside even in that moment. That sense of a celebration too heavy to feel like a pure celebration is something that lingers over this subject even now, more than 8 decades later. The Leningrad siege lasted longer than the entire American involvement in World War I and World War II combined. It killed more civilians than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. It was endured not by soldiers trained for combat, but by grandmothers, school children, factory workers, artists, and doctors, people who had not been asked whether they were willing to participate in history on these terms. They were not asked, but they were there, and most of them held. If you made it to the end of this video, you now carry a piece of that story. That's not a small thing. History this heavy doesn't travel by itself. It travels because people decide it's worth knowing and worth passing on. If this video added something to your understanding of what happened in Leningrad, share it with someone. Leave a comment with what struck you most. And if there's a chapter of World War II history you want this channel to cover, name it below. The next video covers something that connects directly to what you just heard, the broader Eastern Front, where the scale of what happened in Leningrad was, if anything, even larger. It will be ready soon. Until then, remember what 872 days actually looked like